All right. Hey, welcome everybody. This is our new edition of something we're trying new here at Recorded Future. This is called our CVE Monthly. This is going to be a live streaming monthly edition where we're going to go over and talk about all of the latest vulnerabilities that we've seen over the past month, what their impact could be, and what you need to do about them to defend yourself against them. And here we've got Alan Liska and David Carver here, and I'm really looking forward to this session. Stay tuned. All right, so we're going to kick this off. And again, what the CVE Monthly is designed to do is be able to show you and talk about what we've seen in this latest vulnerabilities. This is all included with a report, which will be attached in the links down below. And we're going to be talking about all of the different things that we've happened to see. And by we, I mean our Insikt research group. We've got two of our experts here from Recorded Future today. I'm joined here by David Carver, who is a senior manager with Insikt Group, and Alan Liska, who's one of our senior threat intelligence analysts here. David, Alan, how are you guys doing today?
Good, thanks for having us.
All right, so
thank you.
Let's jump right into it. This past month, it seemed a little bit lighter, seemed a little bit easier. What did we see?
Well, it would be true to say that it was a little bit quiet this month compared to previous months in 2022, which is, on the one hand, always a good thing from a defense perspective. There's less that you have to drop everything for, weekends, holidays, whatever. But probably a temporary reprieve, almost certainly not evidence of a longer-term trend in lower vulnerability exploitation across a bunch of vendors. And when we're saying quiet, we don't necessarily mean that nothing was disclosed that is of higher criticality. It just means that some of the major players in the software and the hardware space, we didn't see vulnerability, like zero-day vulnerability disclosure at the level that we've seen, for example, at even just last 2 months or the beginning of the year. Now, there are a couple of indicators of things that could hit in the future. So for example, Microsoft is always the big one when we're thinking about zero-day vulnerability exploitation. And while we didn't see anything at the level of Felina for this last month, we did see the publication of proof of concept exploits for two previously disclosed vulnerabilities. Both of them affect Windows. One of them affects Windows and Windows Server. One was disclosed in April. There's a POC exploit for that. One was disclosed in May. There's a POC exploit for that. There was, of other major vendors that we track, a critically rated vulnerability from Cisco in their security device manager. I don't know that we've seen widespread or even confirmed reports on open sources of exploitation. The other vulnerabilities that we saw that were higher risk in this last month were for kind of either lesser widespread or lesser well-known areas. So the ones that, if we're going to be looking at kind of the near future for exploitation, would probably be the ones that got those POC exploits from Microsoft. And then last but not least, as a big honorable mention, Hertzbleed was disclosed, which is a vulnerability that affects, as far as the vendors have disclosed, all IBM processors and many AMD processors. There's been a lot of security attention to that, but no exploitation in the wild as far as we've seen so far.
Sure, and so would it be an exaggeration to say, especially compared with the month before, we look at May and that seemed like a blockbuster month for vulnerabilities. It's been a pretty quiet month from the threat perspective. Does that mean that we're seeing, is everybody taking a break? Is law enforcement action finally working? What are we seeing? Alan?
So June is traditionally a quieter month. If you look at, broadly speaking, if you look at exploit activity, cyber criminal activity specifically, nation states is sort of a different beast, but cyber criminal activity cools off a little bit in June, and this is a tradition going back several years. So likely, whether it's vacations, whether it's summer school, the kids are home with their cyber criminal mommies and daddies, whatever it is, we do tend to see a drop off in activity. Don't let that, as David said, nobody should get a false sense of security here. I like to compare it to the Gloria Gaynor song, I Will Survive, where she sings the part about, I should have changed the lock, I should have taken those keys if I knew you were going to be back here bothering me. I always think of June as the time where security people should be, getting to those projects that they've been putting off for a while because they are constantly putting out fires, and you know, trying to implement new protocols and new systems that are going to help keep them safe while we have a bit of a lull.
Sure, and it seemed like quite a lull there. I mean, I'm looking at, obviously we had Felina, we had a whole bunch of other really terrible vulnerabilities come out here. But, right now we've only seen a couple Microsoft vulnerabilities that are coming out there. You want to talk a little bit about, I know there's one called Dog Walk. Can we talk about that for a second?
Yeah, so I'm going to be, I think, much less technically astute in talking about dog walk, but dog walk is an interesting one because it affects the same Microsoft support diagnostic tool that Felina exploited. It's, at least from the people who have disclosed it, it's seen as not necessarily the same vulnerability, but extraordinarily close in flaw and in exploitation. Dog walk, similar to Felina, Kevin Beaumont from Microsoft had a hand in naming it, although I don't think he himself named it. I think he got a poll from some other folks on Twitter. So it is quite similar. However, at least to my knowledge, and Alan, correct me, but unlike Felina, I don't know that we've seen widespread or even prominent exploitation of dog walk in the same way over the last couple of weeks.
No, I mean it's definitely a concern. It doesn't seem to be widely exploited if it's being exploited at all. I know at least the cyber criminal groups that I track, I'm not seeing any activity from there. I think I'll have to double check this, but I think Kevin had reported seeing some activity of it on his honeypots, but it seems to be relatively minor. Again, though, it's a big concern because if that exploit does get out and is replicated, then obviously it can do a lot of damage. It just hasn't gotten there yet.
I think this brings up an interesting point, and I saw this in a couple different newsletters that were brought up. When you're looking at some of these severe vulnerabilities that have come out, there's oftentimes a really close link. Google's Project Zero actually put out a piece on this, talking about like where some of these vulnerabilities are appearing, particularly in 0 days. A lot of them were just really, really similar, right in that other area of where we've seen past 0 days. And one of the things that was suggested is that maybe we just need to get better at patching. We're not really completely patching these things. What's the goal here? Are we just not doing a good enough job? Do we need to be doing better? Is it just the problem of information security where you can patch one thing, but you're never going to get it all?
Yeah, back in 2005, somebody discovered a vulnerability in the way Internet Explorer handled GIFs or GIFs, and it was a really good 0-day vulnerability. Worked across all versions of Internet Explorer, and basically because web exploit kits were so popular at that time, everybody jumped on it and started exploiting it. Microsoft quickly patched it, but then other criminals and other researchers suddenly realized, oh, there might be other vulnerabilities there. And so they all kind of dived into that one area of code. And then for 10 months straight, we saw new vulnerabilities in roughly the same place. Because, to your point, John, what Microsoft did is, okay, this is the vulnerability. This was how they exploited it. Let's fix this piece of code without taking a broader look at all of the different other areas of potential exploitation or avenues of exploitation that may exist in this code set. David and I have seen this repeatedly during the Patch Tuesday write-ups with, how Microsoft handles script processing. The Chakra Core, every month we seem to find another vulnerability or report on another vulnerability in that. And again, it's because, and it's not, I don't want to say, oh, it's because Microsoft does a bad job of patching, because that's not it at all. It's because, the job is to patch the vulnerability, right? We need to, again, I think holistically think about how we do these things.
Yeah, if I can briefly add to, based on at least one of the rows for some of the vulnerabilities that Google listed as part of their report. They have, I'm not going to get the CVE identifier for the one that they were talking about in relation to Felina, but essentially the one that they listed as a corollary to Felina or a very similar vulnerability was one that exploits ActiveX and Internet Explorer. And while I think on a network protocol standpoint, that's true, there is that similarity. From a particular software component, from my understanding, they're two separate areas. So I think what is a more important kind of way of understanding and looking at that data is to say not that there is necessarily a huge amount of correlation between vulnerability 1 and vulnerability 2 by the way that the software processes things or the component, but to say there are usually fairly widely common CWEs, not CVEs, that define vulnerabilities in a bunch of different software and hardware. And from both a defense and a development perspective, the CWE IDs are the one that you want to focus on to say, what is the stuff that is just consistently coming up in new software or hardware versions, and how do we stop this from both a mitigation perspective and a production perspective?
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. I don't think we, again, as an industry, focus enough on CWEs, and they can be incredibly valuable is in terms of guiding how you do development work and how you handle and process vulnerabilities broadly.
So that brings up an interesting point. One of the things that has recently happened here in the United States is the U.S. Supreme Court decision on Dobbs v. Jackson, which has a lot of political and other ramifications. But in the technology world, one of the things that has come up about this is that there's a lot of data out there that is actively being collected, and there's concern from some parties about the amount of data that could potentially be leaked. I think in the past week, we heard some news reports that were talking about potential data leakage or data vulnerabilities on Planned Parenthood site. Is this a vulnerability? Is this the same thing as like a weakness, or is this something completely different here?
So I think generally what we're talking about here, whether you're talking about period tracker apps or, I know there was a lot of conversation about the kind of trackers that Planned Parenthood uses on their website and so on. I think we're talking about not a vulnerability in terms of something that's exploitable. We're talking about a process vulnerability, that there are flaws in the way that security is handled, or maybe not even that. Your security posture has very quickly changed, but you haven't updated your technology to keep track of it. So, for example, Planned Parenthood having trackers on the website, that's perfectly normal. Abortion is a, completely legal procedure. So, there's been no reason why they wouldn't have trackers. Well, suddenly when you have to worry about, law enforcement possibly, demanding to get that information from you, then now you have a different threat model, and you haven't updated your technology to match what the new threat model is. And it's the same thing with some of the period tracker apps and other types of system that many women rely on as part of this process.
Yeah, to just really quickly kind of piggyback off of that, I anticipate that there is going to be quite a lot of both, you know, technical write-ups, but then a bit more kind of on the editorial and the think piece variety that is going to criticize what are seen as vulnerabilities across both of those scales over the next 6 months to 12 months as they affect user data that until recently wasn't seen as an area for sensitivity or exploitation. And it'll be important for people as they're kind of reading that and ingesting that information to understand that where there is a kind of along the level of like a Felina, where there is a inbuilt software flaw, the onus is on the software or the hardware manufacturer to address that, but 9 times out of 10, they're already trying to do that. So it's not like they've left something open intentionally. Typically where it's perhaps a little bit more appropriate to have an onus on an organization to fix the security is where it's not a security flaw, it's a security posture or process that probably could easily have been fixed by just doing the default, security configurations across things like cloud infrastructure or web applications or something else along those lines.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense there. And I think these can be very confusing issues for some people. But it also highlights the fact that we are living in very interesting times and they might be getting more interesting, right? Like I know for example, the Heartbleed vulnerability that was disclosed was really part of a preprint paper for the upcoming, I think it's the 31st Usenix Security Symposium. Also coming in August, we have Black Hat, DEFCON. These large conferences have historically been the place where we see a number of new vulnerabilities getting dropped. But I guess I'm going to ask you guys: should we expect that? Should we expect a whole slew of new vulnerabilities? Is this just kind of the quiet before the storm, or is it going to be a quieter year this year because it's there's been still concerns around the remnants of a pandemic?
I don't know. We may have a bunch of pent up research that is finally released as Black Hat and DEFCON come out. I always encourage caution though, as the reports come out of Black Hat and DEFCON, because much like Hertzbleed, a lot of the vulnerabilities that are discussed are basically science experiments. That hey, in theory we could do this if we have perfect line of sight and 17 Pringles cans lined up and the moon is in Aquarius or whatever wherever the moon is supposed to be, then this will work. So just read beyond the headlines and really understand what the actual threat is for some of the vulnerabilities that will be announced at Black Hat and DEFCON.
Yeah, I think as a critical second point to that, even the researchers behind Hertzbleed, at least as recently as the last couple of weeks when I looked at that, they said we don't know how to exploit this in the wild. So even though from a effect and vulnerability standpoint, Hertzbleed does affect, like I said, all Intel processors and most AMD processors. If Intel and AMD are to be believed, and I think we can on this one, the way that you can actually take advantage of that, not just from a can it work at all, but also can it be widely exploited as part of major penetration testing packages or criminal exploits, that has not happened yet. And when the security researchers themselves are saying, beats us how we would do this in the wild, chances are that that level of exploitation is beyond most other operators in the criminal space. So it's not something, as goes for, honestly, a lot of high complexity vulnerabilities, it is not something I would worry about until somebody puts out a public proof of concept exploit. Then start to worry.
Yeah, I think that's always the challenge that we have here is whether or not should I be panicked? Should I be not panicked? I know in previous months we've seen things like Log4Shell and where it just sent the security community into a tizzy, and now we seem to be having a little bit of lull, and it's always that concern of do I need to amp up? Do I need to go crazy there? We've got just a couple minutes left here. I wanted to hand it over to you guys and say, what's next? What are we going to be expecting in this month? It is still the summer. Is it going to be another quiet leading up into Black Hat DEFCON, or are we going to start seeing some more action here?
So, sorry, I'm focused on the Let's Go Crazy, and now I have Prince stuck in my head. This is just a musical episode. Sorry, John. We're already seeing a ramp up in ransomware attacks. I know Caracut, which is a lot of old members of Conti, flooded their extortion site with 30 new victims recently. and we're seeing other types of ransomware attacks really start to pick back up after seeing a couple months of decline. So I imagine if we take ransomware as sort of an indicator, other types of attacks are probably back up and on the rise, so we should expect to see that. As far as vulnerabilities, I'll leave it to David to prognosticate that, because I don't really know what's coming out of the pike. We're kind of in a new post, even though Microsoft denies it, we're really in a post-Patch Tuesday world, which is kind of, I think we don't really know what to expect.
Yeah, I'll say, particularly from a security standpoint, anybody who tells you what's going to happen over the next 30 days is lying. But I can tell you that there are certain factors that are more or less likely to drive vulnerability exploitation over the next, let's say, 30 to 60 days. So the first one, and this has been a trend really for the last, I want to say, 2 to 3 years, is there's a fairly broad spectrum of affected products and services, to include, and it usually does, up-to-date versions of stuff that is, under exploitation. So if something comes out in a major way for any of the vendors that we track, it's probably for recent versions. And then additionally, there's a pretty good spectrum across both individual consumer user level hardware and software and major enterprise hardware and software. So I don't anticipate that trend declining. I think that if you're, a major enterprise and you're running enterprise level technology, software or hardware, get ready for something else big over the next 3 to 6 months. Outside of that, as a very, very specific tactical point, it would not surprise me if either at the level of Microsoft, security diagnostic tool itself, or some other policy or command line utility within that framework, somebody finds something bad within the next month, because as Alan pointed out, once people start looking in an area, you poke a little bit, you're probably going to find some more.
I think that's probably the most salient point right there, is that's kind of the heart of all of these vulnerabilities. Just keep poking at them, you're going to find more. And I think that both on the defender side and on the research side, we're going to see that, and we'll be back here next month to talk about it. I want to go ahead and say thank you to everybody who's out there. Thank you very much for watching this. We'll be promoting this on some more channels here, and be doing this again every month here coming up. So if you'd like to see this live, maybe chat live with us on the next one, we'll be back in the first week of every month, just up here talking about it. The heads may rotate a little bit, but we're going to be up here chatting. David, thank you very much for joining us. Really appreciate your time. Are you still in London right now?
I am, yes. The jet lag is finally over, which means it's time for me to head back tomorrow and only get one nice day of feeling normal. Yep.
And Alan, again, thank you very much for I gotta say, for a ransomware sommelier, I would have expected to see a few more bottles of wine in the background there.
I have the Bordeaux Chateau. I mean, or at least the Margaux Chateau. Does that count? So it's funny, when I've taken the WSET exams, and John, I think you know this, or maybe you don't, because they may not have had them online when you took them. You have to be in a room that has no wine symbology. So no wine bottles, no wine books, no wine anything, which meant that when I took the WSET exams, I had to take them in my son Bruce's room, because that is the only room in our house that doesn't have any wine. Like, even our bathroom has a map of Bordeaux on the wall. So yeah, it's bad.
That's that can be a problem when your hobby becomes detrimental to your test. And you actually have a new report coming out for wine something, right?
If all goes well, I'm submitting it today. Yes, wine, whiskey, vodka, and cheese fraud. So it's really interesting. It turns out when you collect a lot of data on fraud in our, as we do in our platform, you actually get a lot of information about real world fraud. So we were able to do a deep dive based on data we pulled from the platform on what's going on in the world of wine fraud, whiskey fraud, vodka fraud. I know I sound like a Chumbawamba song. Damn it, I'm still musical today. And then some cheese fraud to go with it. So not only are we going to release the report probably in the next week or so, but we're doing an event in DC at the end of July to sort of talk about the findings.
Well, I look very much forward to reading that and hopefully cracking open a glass of wine as I do so. Again, thanks very much for everybody watching. Thanks, Alan. Thanks, David. And we'll see you back next